He fired me in front of the entire leadership team, his voice loud enough to echo down the hallway. Martin Reed didn't just end my job. He tried to humiliate me. He leaned on the table, smirking as he called me a numbers guy who could never lead, a man who should be grateful for the little he'd been given. Every face in the room turned toward me, waiting for me to fight back. But I didn't. I just stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked out without a single word. What Martin didn't know was that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. In fact, I wasn't leaving powerless. 2 weeks earlier, I had received something that changed everything, a truth I hadn't shared with anyone. It was the kind of thing that could flip the entire company upside down in a single move. While Martin celebrated my exit, I was already thinking about my return. Quietly, strategically. No one would see it coming, least of all him. The way I planned it, the day he found out would be the day his whole world collapsed. And when that moment came, I made sure he wouldn't just lose his position. He'd lose everything. It was a quiet morning on my 30th birthday. No party, no celebration. Just me at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a pile of unopened mail. That's when I saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope with my father's old company seal pressed into red wax. My hands froze for a second. My father had passed years ago, but I knew his lawyer still handled certain matters for the family. I broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper inside. The letter was short, typed in my father's precise style, and signed with his familiar bold signature. As I read, my pulse quickened. It explained that, through a trust he had quietly managed, I now held the controlling shares of the company, 90% to be exact. The letter made it clear. This was not an accident, not a mistake. It was part of his plan all along. He had chosen my 30th birthday for a reason. In his words, leadership is not given, it is recognized. And you will know when to use it. My father had been a shrewd man, not one to hand over power before he was certain it would be used wisely. The letter hinted at something else too. He'd kept my ownership hidden, so I could see the truth about the people around me without the distortion of power. The truth, as it turned out, had been ugly. Over the years, I had been sidelined more times than I could count. In meetings, my ideas would be brushed aside, only to reappear days later from someone else's mouth, suddenly deemed brilliant. I had been told to stick to spreadsheets, to let the visionaries handle the big picture. Promotions passed me by, while less qualified people, often Martin's favorites, rose quickly. At first, I thought patience would win. That if I worked harder, stayed humble, and proved myself, they'd see my value. But my father's words in that letter made something click in my mind. I hadn't been overlooked by accident. They had built a system to keep people like me in the background while they played their political games. I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. 90%. That wasn't just influence, it was absolute control. The kind of power Martin feared more than anything. He liked to act untouchable, but deep down, he knew control of the company was fragile. Now that control rested in my hands, whether he knew it or not. I remembered something my father used to say when I was a boy, watching him work late at the office. Power means nothing if you don't know when to use it. And in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with that letter in my hand, I knew I wouldn't waste this. I didn't tell anyone, not my colleagues, not even my closest friends. The more invisible my position, the more dangerous it became for the people who had underestimated me. I went to work each day as if nothing had changed, quietly watching, quietly remembering every slight, every stolen idea, every smirk from Martin when he reminded me that I was lucky to even have a seat at the table. Now I had something far better than luck. I had the means to rewrite the rules entirely. And when the time came, I wouldn't just take my seat at the table. I would own the table. The morning after Martin's public dismissal of me, I walked into Mr. Harrington's office. He was the kind of lawyer who always looked like he had stepped straight out of an old courtroom drama. Three-piece suit, gold watch, eyes that missed nothing. Without small talk, I placed my father's trust letter and the share certificates on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, read every word twice, then looked up. "Ethan, this isn't just ownership. This is command." I leaned back, letting his words sink in. "I need to know there's no loophole, no clause he can twist to fight this." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that told me he'd already checked. "There isn't. The trust was airtight. Your father saw to that. If you choose, you can walk into the boardroom today and remove the CEO with a single vote." That was the confirmation I needed, but proof of ownership wasn't enough. I wanted the board to see not only that I had the power, but that Martin was unfit to hold his position in the first place. That would make his removal not just legal, but inevitable. The next call I made was to Caroline Winters, the trust manager who had worked with my father for over 2 decades. She was precise, efficient, and had access to more company history than anyone else alive. I met her in a quiet cafe far from the city, where no familiar faces would spot us. Without a word, she slid a slim leather folder across the table. Inside was a compilation that could bury a career. Line items showing unexplained expense reports, luxury travel billed to the company without corresponding meetings, inflated consultant fees paid to firms Martin personally owned. But that wasn't all. Caroline had included copies of internal HR complaints, formal grievances from employees about intimidation, verbal abuse, and promotions handed out as rewards for loyalty rather than merit. I closed the folder slowly. "How long have you been keeping this?" "Long enough to know you'd need it someday," she replied, sipping her tea without breaking eye contact. With Harrington's legal confirmation and Caroline's documentation, the foundation of my plan was set. But a simple removal wasn't enough. I wanted the moment to be unforgettable, a turning point the entire leadership team would talk about for years. I began building a file thicker than any annual report. Every receipt, every statement, every signature from Martin was cataloged and cross-referenced. I requested board meeting transcripts, performance reviews, and even old emails that hinted at his arrogance. The more I compiled, the clearer my strategy became. I would walk into that boardroom, not as the man they thought they fired, but as the one holding the ultimate authority to end Martin's reign in an instant. I wouldn't send a memo, I wouldn't drop hints, and I certainly wouldn't give him the satisfaction of bracing for it. Live humiliation was the only way. He thrived on spectacle when he tore people down. Now I'd give him one in return. Only this time, the audience would be the people whose approval he craved most. Late at night, in the quiet of my apartment, I'd spread the documents across the table, rehearsing the order I'd present them. Every page had a purpose, every detail a knife hidden in plain sight. By the time I was finished, the evidence wouldn't just remove Martin. It would make it impossible for him to ever step foot in another boardroom again. The clock was ticking, and Martin had no idea the fuse was already burning. The days after my exit were strangely quiet, almost too quiet. I stayed away from the building, but I knew the corridors would be buzzing. People would be leaning over cubicle walls, whispering theories about where I'd gone and why. Some would assume I'd found another job. Others, more cynical, might think I'd been pushed out for good. That uncertainty was exactly what I wanted. It gave me space to work without anyone suspecting what was coming. Martin, of course, couldn't resist filling the silence. I started hearing from a few trusted contacts that he'd been making the rounds, telling anyone who would listen that I wasn't cut out for real leadership. According to him, I was a dependable numbers guy, sure, but too cautious, too hesitant, too safe to ever take the reins. He made it sound like he'd done me a favor, setting me free to find a smaller role where I could thrive. It was a clever move on his part. He knew how to control a narrative, how to plant just enough doubt so people wouldn't question his version of events. But while he was busy shaping the story, I was shaping the ending. I spent those days working in near isolation, focusing on precision. Every piece of evidence I had was reviewed, labeled, and placed in a leather portfolio. I rehearsed the flow of my speech until I could deliver it without a single pause. My goal wasn't just to prove him unfit. It was to dismantle the illusion he'd built around himself. I visited my tailor, the same one my father had trusted for years. I asked for something sharp and understated, a suit that would speak before I even opened my mouth. Power isn't always about being loud. Sometimes it's about being impossible to ignore. When I looked in the mirror at the final fitting, I didn't see the quiet operations director Martin thought he'd humiliated. I saw the man who was about to take everything from him. There was a discipline to my preparation. I timed my arrival so it would interrupt the meeting at its peak, ensuring the full attention of every board member. I thought through every possible reaction Martin might have, laughter, denial, anger, and planned how to counter each one without losing composure. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. It would be a controlled, clinical dismantling. The hardest part was staying silent in the meantime. More than once, I felt the urge to leak hints, to let the tension build ahead of time. But giving Martin even a second to prepare would be a mistake. I wanted the shock to hit him in real time, in front of the only people whose opinions could end his career. Outside of those preparations, I kept my routine simple. Early mornings, long walks, evenings spent going over my notes. The storm was coming, but I stayed in the eye of it, calm, deliberate, certain. Every step was calculated, every choice intentional. This wasn't just about removing a CEO. It was about ensuring that when Martin left that room, he wouldn't just lose his title. He'd lose the credibility, the influence, and the arrogance that had carried him for so long. When the day finally came, the suit was ready, the evidence was airtight, and my speech was etched into memory. Martin thought the whispers would fade and I'd be forgotten. What he didn't know was that I was about to make sure his name would only be remembered for one thing: the day he fell. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom muffled the sound of conversation inside, but I could still make out Martin's voice, confident, animated, the way he always was when he thought he had a room under his thumb. I waited just long enough for the discussion to hit a steady rhythm before I pushed the doors open. The heads of the board members turned one by one as I stepped in. A few looked startled, others simply curious. Martin, sitting at the head of the table, froze for the briefest second before forcing a grin. "Well, look who decided to visit," he said lightly, his tone dripping with mockery. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked the length of the polished table, every step deliberate, until I reached his seat. Without asking, I placed my leather portfolio on the table and sat down in the chair he'd claimed as his throne. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through. From the portfolio, I pulled out the crisp documents, share certificates, legal confirmations, all bearing the signatures and seals that left no room for interpretation. I spread them neatly in front of me, facing the board so each member could see. "I hold 90% of this company," I said, my voice steady but carrying enough weight to fill the room. Effective immediately, I am exercising that control. For a moment, the boardroom was utterly still. One man leaned forward, scanning the top page as if he wasn't sure he'd read it right. A woman 2 seats down glanced at Martin, searching his face for guidance. Martin let out a short, forced laugh. "All right, this is cute. Some kind of what? Revenge play? You think walking in here with a few papers changes anything?" I didn't blink. "These aren't just papers. They're ownership records filed with the trust and verified by corporate law. 90% means one vote, mine, outweighs everyone else in this room combined." He shifted in his seat, the smirk starting to crack. "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, keeping my tone level. "And I am." From inside the portfolio, I drew a second document, the official motion to remove him as CEO. I slid it toward the board's secretary. "Record my vote." The pen scratched against paper as she complied, her eyes darting between us. The result was immediate, undeniable. With my single vote, the motion passed. No discussion. No need for consensus. Martin's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes flicked to the board members, looking for someone to back him. None did. The air in the room shifted. The quiet respect he'd commanded for years had evaporated in seconds. I turned slightly toward the 2 uniformed security officers I'd arranged to have waiting outside. "Please escort Mr. Rhee from the premises," I said, my voice still calm, almost polite. The sound of his chair scraping the floor was the loudest thing in the room. He didn't resist, but the disbelief on his face was almost more satisfying than if he had. The man who had paraded his authority, who had belittled and dismissed me in front of others, now walked out under someone else's orders. When the doors closed behind him, I gathered my papers and placed them back into the portfolio. No cheers, no applause, just the quiet realization among the board that the balance of power had shifted entirely. I stood, glanced briefly at the seat I'd just claimed, and said only, "We have work to do." Then I walked out, leaving the weight of what had just happened to settle in their minds. The ambush had landed exactly as I intended, swift, clean, and impossible to undo. The board sat in a strange silence after Martin's departure, the energy in the room unsteady, like the air after a sudden storm. Some members looked unsettled, others quietly relieved. I let the silence hang just long enough before I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "This company was built on a vision that's been lost," I began, my voice steady but deliberate. "It wasn't meant to be a playground for egos or a machine that chews up its own people. It was meant to innovate, to lead with purpose. And that's exactly what we're going to bring back." I didn't sugarcoat the state of things. I spoke plainly about the culture of fear, the lack of transparency, and the way talent had been driven away by politics and favoritism. But I also laid out the blueprint for change, clearer accountability at every level, leadership based on merit, and investment in ideas that actually moved the business forward. I didn't want them to just hear promises. I wanted them to see that I had already thought through every step. By the time I finished, no one was arguing. A few heads even nodded in quiet agreement. They knew something had been broken for a long time, even if they hadn't admitted it out loud. The next morning, I made the move I knew mattered most. I called an all-hands meeting. No emails filtered through department heads, no selective invites. Everyone was told to gather in the main auditorium. I wanted every single person to hear directly from me, without spin, without someone else's version of the story. Walking onto that stage, I could feel the tension in the room. Faces in the crowd shifted between curiosity, skepticism, and cautious hope. Some still didn't know what to make of my sudden reappearance. I took the microphone and, without any preamble, said, "Last week, I was fired from this company." The ripple that moved through the audience was immediate. A low murmur, exchanged glances. I let them react for a few seconds before continuing. I was told I wasn't fit to lead, that my place was in the background. But here I am, standing in front of you, because what happened to me wasn't just about me. It was about what this place had become. I spoke about the walls that had gone up between departments, the creativity that had been stifled, the way people had stopped feeling like their work mattered. I told them this wasn't about replacing one person at the top with another. It was about tearing out the rot that had taken hold. "This is not a leadership change," I said, my voice carrying through the hall. "This is a rescue mission." I didn't offer empty motivation. Instead, I gave them concrete commitments. Better communication, fair opportunities for advancement, and recognition based on results, not alliances. I promised transparency in decisions and accountability for anyone, myself included, who failed to live up to those standards. By the time I stepped off the stage, I could feel a shift in the air. People weren't cheering, not yet. But they were watching with a different kind of focus, the kind you see when someone starts to believe change might actually be possible. As I moved through the crowd, employees I'd barely spoken to before approached me. Some to shake my hand, others just to say, "It's about time." It wasn't trust yet, but it was the first spark of it. And that was enough to know the soul of the company could be brought back. The 2 weeks that followed weren't loud or dramatic. They were deliberate, methodical, and above all, quiet. I didn't call attention to the changes I was making. No public firings, no confrontations in front of the team. This wasn't about creating fear. It was about removing the people who had thrived on it. I started with the people most leaders overlook, the ones who see everything but rarely get asked for their perspective. Security guards who knew which executives left early without notice, receptionists who overheard conversations in hushed tones, maintenance staff who watched who stayed late and who simply pretended to. I made a point of speaking to them first, not in formal interviews, but in casual, honest conversations. Their insights were sharp and consistent. The same names came up again and again. People who had been Martin's eyes and ears, not to serve the company, but to protect his position. These loyalists had created a buffer around him, filtering out dissent and punishing those who didn't play along. I took notes, cross-checking their accounts with performance data and HR records. I didn't move hastily. Every decision had to be backed by more than just reputation or rumor. But when the pattern was undeniable, I acted. One by one, the most toxic figures were quietly released. Severance handled, access revoked, departures explained in neutral terms. No drama, no gossip, just the quiet removal of the barriers holding the company hostage. At the same time, I turned my attention to the other side of the spectrum, the people who had been doing extraordinary work without recognition. Engineers whose innovations had been sidelined because they didn't curry favor. Interns who had been treated as invisible despite their skill. Mid-level managers who had the respect of their teams, but had been passed over for promotions in favor of political allies. I started pulling them into leadership meetings, not as observers but as participants. Some were hesitant at first, unsure if it was safe to speak openly. It didn't take long for their ideas to prove that they should have been in these rooms all along. Promotions were offered without warning, surprising people who had long since stopped expecting fairness. HR was another battlefield entirely. Under Martin's influence, it had been less about supporting employees and more about shielding leadership from accountability. I brought in a new head of HR, someone with a track record for handling both compliance and compassion. Policies were rewritten, grievance procedures strengthened, and anonymity guaranteed for those filing complaints. It wasn't about creating an environment where people could get away with anything. It was about ensuring everyone, from interns to executives, played by the same rules. I kept my presence visible but unintrusive. I'd walk through departments unannounced, stop to ask how projects were going, or sit with a small team during their break just to listen. The more I listened, the more people realized this wasn't a temporary performance. It was the new normal. By the end of those 2 weeks, the office felt different in ways you couldn't fully measure on paper. Conversations were freer. Eyes no longer darted toward the door at the sound of approaching footsteps. The atmosphere wasn't perfect. Wounds take time to heal. But the tension that had once gripped the building had started to loosen. It wasn't the kind of purge that made headlines. It was the kind that worked in silence, leaving only a stronger, fairer foundation behind. And that was exactly what the company needed. The changes in leadership had cleared the air, but I knew that removing bad actors wasn't enough to truly turn the company around. If we wanted a lasting transformation, we needed something that would actively shape the culture into what it should have been all along. That's where the idea for the People First initiative began. It started as a simple principle. The people who created value for the company should be the ones recognized and rewarded, not the ones who navigated politics the best. No more promotions handed out for loyalty to the wrong person. No more recognition for those who took credit for others' work. Every reward, every opportunity, would be tied directly to contribution and collaboration. I formed a small task force drawn from different departments, designers, engineers, administrative staff, and even a couple of junior employees who had shown promise. They helped me design a transparent point system for achievements. Innovation, problem-solving, teamwork, and mentorship would be valued just as highly as hitting sales numbers. For the first time, the quiet heroes of the company would have their impact measured and acknowledged. We rolled it out quietly but intentionally. Managers were instructed to submit monthly reports highlighting team contributions, but these reports weren't just reviewed by upper management. They were shared across departments so everyone could see who was driving results. Recognition became public, and it wasn't limited to titles or revenue figures. If someone stayed late to help another team meet a deadline, it was noted. If an intern came up with an idea that saved resources, it was celebrated. Within weeks, the atmosphere began to shift. The guarded tones and forced smiles that had once filled the office were replaced with open conversations and actual laughter. People lingered in meeting rooms after official business was done, bouncing ideas back and forth because they wanted to, not because they had to. I started noticing something else. Projects that had been left to stagnate were suddenly moving forward. Teams were taking ownership, experimenting, and finding new solutions without waiting for permission. Some employees even stayed after hours, not out of fear or obligation, but because they were excited about what they were working on. There was no memo asking them to do this. It happened because people finally felt like their work mattered. Walking through the office late one evening, I overheard 2 junior developers chatting in the break room. One of them said, "It's like he came back." The phrase stuck with me. It spread quietly at first, whispered between colleagues who had seen how different the place felt now. Soon, I started hearing it more often, sometimes from people I didn't even know personally. "He came back" wasn't about my physical return. It was about the feeling of having leadership that actually showed up for its people. It meant the company they had once been proud to work for was returning, piece by piece. The initiative wasn't perfect, and there were still adjustments to make, but the difference was undeniable. The energy was no longer one of survival, it was one of growth. And for the first time in years, the building felt alive again. What I didn't tell anyone was that this was just the foundation. People First was only the beginning of something much larger I had planned. A culture that could withstand any storm because it was built on the one thing Martin had never valued: its people. 12 months after the takeover, the transformation was visible in every corner of the company. The sterile, tension-filled halls of the past had been replaced with spaces humming with activity and quiet confidence. Department heads didn't just meet quarterly anymore. They collaborated weekly, sharing strategies openly instead of guarding them like state secrets. The numbers reflected what was already obvious to anyone walking through the building. This was no longer a company trying to survive, it was a company thriving. Revenue had not only stabilized but broken every previous record. The boost wasn't from flashy short-term tactics or risky gambles. It came from steady, thoughtful growth driven by teams who believed in their work. Clients were returning, citing the difference in professionalism and the creativity in solutions they hadn't seen in years. Word spread, and new partnerships began to form with companies that shared the same values. Morale was higher than anyone could remember. People smiled when they arrived in the morning, and that energy carried through the day. Annual employee surveys, once dreaded for the harsh truths they exposed, now brimmed with constructive feedback and genuine optimism. Instead of anonymous complaints, there were suggestions for further improvements, proof that people trusted leadership enough to voice ideas without fear. The board had also evolved. A year earlier, it had been a collection of cautious, traditional voices that resisted change. Now, thanks to carefully considered appointments, it included younger professionals with fresh perspectives and members from diverse backgrounds who brought insight into markets and communities the company had never seriously engaged with before. Decisions were still strategic, but they were made with an awareness of ethics, sustainability, and long-term impact. The culture shift had taken root at the highest level. As for Martin, he had all but disappeared. His name no longer came up in industry conversations, and when it did, it was followed by a quiet shake of the head or a dismissive shrug. His old allies had distanced themselves quickly, unwilling to be tied to his reputation. Whatever opportunities he might have sought had evaporated, leaving him without the influence he once wielded so carelessly. It was on a Monday morning, exactly 1 year to the day since the boardroom ambush, that I decided to move into the CEO's office. I'd left it untouched until then, choosing to work from a modest corner space while the company rebuilt itself. But now the time felt right, not as a claim to power, but as a symbol of stability. I didn't bring boxes of personal belongings or fill the shelves with trophies. Instead, I carried a single-framed photograph, my father and I standing side by side on the day the company first opened its doors. I placed it on the desk, angled so it faced me. It wasn't there to remind me of the victory. It was there to remind me of the responsibility. This company had been built to last, and now, finally, it was ready for the future my father had imagined. The board meeting that morning was calm, almost peaceful, so different from the chaos I'd walked into a year ago. Conversations flowed without shouting matches. Decisions were reached without anyone trying to crush the other's ideas. I sat at the head of the table, listening more than I spoke, and it hit me. Leadership isn't about volume or ego. It's about vision and respect, the kind my father lived by, and the kind I had promised myself I'd bring back. When the meeting wrapped up, I didn't head straight for my office. Instead, I took a slow walk through every department. In engineering, I leaned over a workstation to hear about a new prototype and laughed when one of the developers joked about how different things are now compared to the Martin days. In marketing, I congratulated the team on their latest campaign and asked how they'd come up with the concept. I stopped in the break room to have coffee with the interns, listening to their ideas like they were already part of the next big breakthrough. Because, in my eyes, they were. Every handshake I offered was intentional. Every conversation was real. These weren't just employees to me. They were the reason we'd survived the storm and rebuilt stronger than before. And as I moved through the building, I realized something. My real victory wasn't in seeing Martin escorted out of the boardroom. It was in seeing life return to these halls. Yes, revenge had been satisfying. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But it was a fleeting satisfaction, sharp and temporary. What stayed with me was this. Knowing we had turned a broken, toxic company into a place where people actually wanted to come to work. By late afternoon, I found myself back in the CEO's office. The sunlight streamed across my desk, catching the frame that held the photo of my father and me on the company's opening day. I sank into his old leather chair, running my hand along the worn armrest. I wasn't sitting here as the man they fired. I wasn't even sitting here as the man who had outplayed them. I was here as the leader they never saw coming. The one who rebuilt this place not for revenge, but for the people who believed in it. And now I was ready to lead. Do you think I was right to take back control of the company and rebuild it? Or should I have just walked away after being fired? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life revenge and redemption stories you won't want to miss.